Hello everyone, welcome to another Versus video. We are doing a deck tech for the deck that I will be battling with. Benjamin J. Beatdown won the Open last weekend with pretty much mono white. A little bit of red cards in here, but it's basically just mono white dudes. And I decided that I wanted to play this deck, so here we are. And
it's a little different from the normal BBD decks. I don't see any Thragtusk, Obsidians, or Whip of Erebos.
It's true, yeah. Not playing Thought Caesar Heroes Downfall. And honestly, don't know what to do with my hands at this point, but
you just get to cast Ride Militant and attack.
Yeah, I'm not too crazy about that, but you know it is pretty sweet. I actually had the pleasure of playing with this deck some last night, so yeah, it's a cool deck. It's got a lot of power to it, and basically the deck functions off of like the way the metagame is now. There's a lot of like of the mid-rangey decks like mono black that are pretty dominant. And this deck is really good because it can basically put so much early pressure on the deck to overload the removal with, where they don't have time to kill all your guys. Yeah. Like they might play a removal spell every single turn, but you're just one step ahead because of like you have 12 1-drops that get in before they start playing removal. Especially if you're on the play and you go like 1-drop into Precinct Captain, they have to kill your Precinct Captain, but they're constantly taking damage from whatever 1-drop you played until the end of the game. And so basically we have 12 1-drops. We have 8 good ones and 4 Boros elites, as I like to put it.
I actually like Boros elite. So the original version of this deck, Ross Merriam played it in one of the first opens.
Right.
And I wrote about it a few times, played around with it. And we had Judge's Familiar instead of Boros elite. So there are worse options.
There are worse options,
than
it's
the
true.
Boros elite. I actually really like Boros elite. It makes it more likely that you're just going to be attacking with your elites and Skyjacks to turn Battalion on for them, because since they're not 1/1s, to become 3/3s, it just allows you to make blocking really awkward for your opponents.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Boros elite's better the later the game goes, but early on, like I definitely want to lead with a militant or a soldier. Soldier's just the best card to lead with here. But basically, like you have a lot of like powerful, aggressive options on turn 1, and then when we get to turn 2, we basically have Precinct Captain and Daring Skyjack. I don't really consider Azorius Arrestor a 2-drop. Usually want to play him later in the game.
Yeah.
And Skyjack and Precinct Captain are both awesome. Like Captain is such a powerful threat by himself. He's good on defense and offense, and your opponent always wants to get him off the table as soon as possible because the threat of him making a guy every turn is just too much for a lot of decks to beat. And then Skyjack is just like 3 power for 2 mana. It's just a very good rate.
It's our Watch Wolf.
Yeah, it basically is. And then Azorius Arrestor, which like you don't really want to play this on turn 2. It's pretty mediocre if you do, but it's really good on turn 4. On turn 4, you can play like Azorius Arrestor, lock down their blocker, then you can activate your Mutavault and hit them for a bunch of damage. And that sets it up for like next turn you can get them with like a lethal Brave the Elements. Or maybe you have like Boros Charm to finish the job, or a Johnny to throw like a guy in the air to finish the job. So yeah, I really do like the Azorius Arrestors, even though they're not like a great 2-drop. And then we have Frontline Medic to finish the curve out. And the thing I love about Frontline Medic is, as the game progresses, these creatures all become much worse. Your opponent starts playing things like Desecration Demons, or Nightveil Specters, or like
Grand Merchant of Asphodel.
Yeah, or cards like that, or like Blood Barons, or various things that you can't really start attack through very well with these creatures. Frontline Medic still lets you do that. So like early in the game, there's not going to be much your opponent plays that you can't attack through with these guys. But once you get to that point, then you have Frontline Medic to give all your guys indestructibility as you swing in. Also can counter Sphinx's Revelation, which doesn't happen that often, but it is something to be mindful of. So beyond the actual creature base, we have a lot of cat tokens that go with our Ajani, Collar of the Prides. We have Ajani. Ajani never ultimates, but I have the cats in here just as kind of a good omen to hope that actually happens.
Not happening.
But Ajani is pretty awesome as, much like Frontline Medic, providing a way to get in for damage later in the game. Putting counters on your guys can make them big enough to swing through blockers, and the -3 ability is like a good like kill you ability. Just throwing like a Frontline Medic in the air for 6 damage is oftentimes good enough, especially if you can set it up the turn before. Like play a Johnny, put a counter on a guy, then next turn throw that guy in the air and hit him for like 8 or 10.
Yeah.
So Ajani is like a really good finisher. Spear of Heliod, same thing. I actually liked Spear so much when I was playing last night that I think The one thing I don't like about this deck is that there's only one spear. I think there should be 2, maybe even 3. The card was so good.
Yeah, the earlier versions of the deck had a Johnny in the sideboard and 3 spears in the main. And I always wanted a Johnny to be in the main deck. And spear is like the card like you want to draw one every game, but you never want to draw more than one.
Yeah.
So 3 might be too many, 2 might be the right number. But the card just has such a giant impact on games that you want to have it on turn 3 almost every game.
Yeah, every time I had a spear in my opening hand, I did like a little bit of a fist pump because I knew I was going to win that game. So, and then we also have 8 other cards. We have 4 Boros Charm, 4 Brave the Elements. I think these cards are kind of what makes the deck function. Brave the Elements is just an awesome card that serves as both a it really just does everything. It's a counter spell for removal spells. And it's also give your entire team unblockability. There's so many decks in the format that are playing Nykthos, which means there's so many decks that all their creatures are the same color.
Yeah.
So Brave the Elements is basically just like, you
Kill
can't
you.
block. Yeah, you're dead. And it also saves your guys from removal spells and so forth as well. It also a lot of times can serve as like a Rootborn defenses too. If your opponent attacks you with a bunch of guys, you can block all their creatures, then play Brave, and you get to save all your guys and kill all of theirs. And then Boros Charm is kind of a worse Brave the Elements because it's like harder to cast, it's harder to leave 2 mana open, and it's easier to play around. But at the same time, it does 4 damage to them, which a lot of games come down to like you get them down to 4, and then you just can't attack anymore, and you're just hoping to draw Boros Charm to finish the job.
Yeah.
But it can also serve as like a defensive Brave the Elements too by
Giving
saving
your
all your
guys
guys from like a
indestructible.
Mizium Mortars or something. Yeah, giving all your guys indestructible. The
Definitely.
ability for Double Strike is pretty much almost never relevant. It's very rare that ends up being more damage than just doing 4 to them.
Correct.
But it can be useful in combat sometimes to kill a guy.
Yeah. Although since we have a Johnny's in the main, at some point like we might make a guy a 5/5, where the double strike could do more damage. And the one thing that I ran into a lot that is important to keep in mind is that Brave the Elements does not affect your Mutavaults because they are not white.
Correct.
So when you're calculating out, all your racing damage when you're trying to race your opponents, you just have to remember that your Brave will not make your Mutavault unblockable.
Yeah, they can still block your Mutavault. You still have to remember that for sure. Speaking of Mutavault, our mana base is basically just we have 8 of the red-white lands, and the rest are plains and Mutavaults. And Mutavaults, in my opinion, one of the most important cards of the deck. I don't think this would be a deck if Mutavault wasn't in it, because basically the card does so much for the deck. It turns on Daring Skyjack and Boros Elite, which pretty much is extremely important. It's also very good with a Johnny. You can activate your Mutavault, make it bigger, and then
The counters stick around.
yeah, the counters stick around. So even if they like overload a Mizium Mortars, you still have a big Mutavault. It's very good with Spear of Heliod. So yeah, I think Mutavault's just one of the best cards in the deck, and other than that, the mana base is pretty straightforward. But yeah, this is the Boros deck. Let's jump in on the sideboard. All right, so let's see what awesome sideboard options await our nearly mono-white deck. First off, we have Wear and Tear, and the first time I looked at the sideboard, I thought like there should be like three or four of this card because it's just so good against decks. But the more I've played, the more I realized that actually 1 is probably just the right number because again, like there's a lot of cards like Underworld Connections, Whip of Erebos, like Biden of Thassa, Detention Sphere, that like Wear and Tear is very good against, but at the same time, a lot of those cards you don't care about. Like Underworld Connections, you don't really care about that card because you're trying to kill them before that card matters. So like having an answer to it is not that relevant. And so like as I was playing the deck, I realized like you actually don't care too much about a lot of those enchantments, so you just want 1. It's good against like let's say your opponent's playing like Detention Sphere and Trading Post in the same deck. That's the matchup where you want to bring in that Wear Tear.
That's where you get them.
Glare of Heresy, they're basically like you want this card against like Detention Sphere type decks or decks that are playing like Chain to the Rocks or things like that. It's also very good against Boros Reckoner, which can be a big problem for the deck. For example, like the deck CVM is playing has Chain to the Rocks and Boros Reckoner, so we would definitely consider bringing in Glare of Heresy for that.
It's also good against like Voice of Resurgence and Loxodon Smiter too.
Yeah, exactly. Unflinching Courage, cards that could be a serious problem for this deck. Mizium Mortars is like just kind of a 1-of removal spell. It's very basically I think this is like destroy target Frostburn Weird is basically the purpose of this card in the sideboard. You want it for matchups where your opponent has creatures like that are hard to attack through. Pacifism, kind of the same thing. You want it for cards like that. It's also good against like Night Veil Specters and the like. So is Mizzy Mortars. War Leader's Helix. Honestly, this card was amazing for me when I was playing with the deck. Even though we only have 22 lands, we probably don't want more than one. But the card is very powerful. I like the fact that it can go to the dome or kill a very problematic creature like a Frostburn Weird.
Yeah.
Fiendslayer Paladin and Banisher Priest. Fiendslayer Paladin is very good if like the mono red decks are picking up. Very hard for them to beat the card. Especially if you have like an Ajani or a Spirophilia to go with it, it just becomes almost impossible for them to win. So I really like that card a lot against decks like that. And then
It's also pretty decent against the mono black deck as well.
Yeah, it is. It's okay against that deck. They do have a lot of creatures that can block it profitably, but they can't kill it, which is important. And then Banisher Priest, I think, is amazing. It comes in a lot of matchups. Like, you don't want it against like any of the control-ish decks, but I even like it against mono black. Get rid of those Specters and Desecration Demons so you can keep plowing through. And getting rid of those creatures is also very important for turning off their devotion. Same goes for like the blue decks or any of the devotion decks, really. Like Banisher Priest is really good there.
Yeah, Banisher Priest is very good against the mono blue deck.
Yes. And then Burning Earth is basically just for the Esper control decks. There aren't a whole lot of other decks in the format that fold to it, but I feel like that deck's probably one of the worst matchups for this deck, so I think having a couple cards on your board just for them is perfectly reasonable.
The Esper decks can be tough, but it's one of those decks where we have such a huge trump card in our main deck that if we ever have it on time, we just can't lose. Like if you ever get to Boros Charm or Supreme Verdict, it's nearly impossible to lose to that deck.
Yes.
But if you don't have the Charm and they have the Verdict, it's an uphill struggle.
Yeah, so it's a very uphill battle.
It makes you like those Scry lands a lot.
Yes. They both cast Boros Charm and find Boros Charm.
Yes. Do everything.
That is game. Yep. But yeah, this is the mono whitish deck. We have some green cards in there, Dryad Militant, and a couple of red cards, actual red cards like Boros Charm. But yeah, I'm excited to play with it and see how badly I lose I beat CVM with it. So.